Hello, my name is Jacqueline Gonzalez, and I will be teaching a lesson titled Mother and Daughter, created for 6th graders in language arts. I created the lesson to extend over 2 days, and the objective is that students will be able to understand character traits, story sequence, figurative language used in Mother and Daughter by Gary Soto. They will also be able to understand how their actions and behaviors impact others. The Common Core standards that we are using are language arts, to cite textual evidence, to support analysis, and to make inferences drawn from the text, to describe how the story or drama unfolds, and to talk about characters and how they respond to change in the plot of in a story, to determine words and meanings and phrases used in figurative language. The visual modality that I will be working on is PowerPoint. I will be making visual examples of vocabulary words, examples of the setting, and of other story details. I will have handouts, charts and graphic organizers, as well as using the overhead or the Elmo. For auditory, the students will be reading the story out loud and group and peer sharing. Kinesthetic, they will be getting out of their seats to work in groups to create an anchor chart of the story sequence. The Bloom's taxonomy objectives is cognitive, is to break the story into parts, go over figurative language, analyze the story for moral as well as character traits. Affective is the students will quick write that will allow the students to think of a time where they have been selfish or where they have hurt somebody's feelings. The psychomotor is to get out of their seats and work to create an anchor chart of the story sequence. Adaptations for anybody with special needs. The students will all be held accountable for copying the same work. But as a teacher, I would want to have maybe a worksheet or a printout of those vocabulary words where they will be able to still do the same amount of work, but have it just in case maybe they copy down a little bit slower or just for reference. I would want to have body proximity when it's their turn to read out loud. That way it creates a warning of when it's their turn to read. That will lower anxiety. The other thing that I would do is I would be able to maybe choose a passage for a certain student where maybe I know that they can read without making any mistakes, or I can guide them through the process and they will feel comfortable and confident reading out loud. I would also include the picture examples of all of the vocabulary words and the setting just to kind of help students make connections. My assessment for learning would be I would scaffold the students to be able to complete at least one part of every assignment on their own. The assessment activities are embedded. After reading, they discuss story sequence, character traits, and figurative language. And at the end of the lesson, I would want to have an exit ticket activity where the student must come up with a character trait for one of the characters and cite it from the text all on their own. The materials and the technology that I would need would be just a simple quarter sheet of paper for a quick write, the Promethean board, a PowerPoint of the vocabulary, a copy for each student of the story Mother and Daughter by Gary Soto, a vocabulary matrix or a four-corner vocabulary sheet, a story sequence anchor chart and post-its, a character trait worksheet, a figurative language worksheet, and another simple quarter sheet of paper for the students to use as an exit ticket. For the into, through, and beyond, I would want the students to do a quick write, like I said, about a moment where they've been selfish, and I would want them to share with their elbow partners to go over just so that the students have an example of what it means to really be selfish. And I would go over the vocabulary words for the students to make sure that they have an understanding of the vocabulary words, as well as making sure that they're keeping and creating their own class set of vocabulary, student vocabulary, and that is a depth of knowledge of the level 2. For the through part of the activity, this is where it's a little bit longer. We will read the story, and I will make sure that the students are chosen at random, but by using body proximity, it would kind of reduce the anxiety of the students to be able to participate, but know that if I'm not near them, they can relax and just read and understand the story. And we would review at the end, we would review the parts of story to see if they understand what the introduction, what the rise of the climax is, what the problem is going to be, and how they solve it, etc. I would break the students into groups of 4 or 5 to create a story sequence chart. And my idea for a story sequence chart would be something sort of like this. And what I would want the students to do is to create a story sequence chart and to have the post-its that go on, and where every student is responsible for some part of it, where they would have to talk about the beginning, the rise into the climax, the middle of the story, what the problem is, and then create or look through the solution and how the solution came about. And in order to do that, I would want to make sure that the students understand what every part of the story is, and to do that, I would do something that I've seen where they hold their thumb up if they understand, they hold their thumb to the side if they kind of understand, or they hold their thumb down if they do not understand. And if they don't understand, or if they need a little bit of help, then as a teacher, I would go ahead and go over the parts of the story. The second through part would be that the students would go over character traits, and I would refresh the students as to what character traits are, and we would look through character traits for the main character of the story, and her name is Yoli. And so we would go over, using our story, we would highlight some of the character traits that they find in her, and I would want them to go through and cite the evidence. And so in order to do that, I would also have another worksheet for them to do that, such as here, where they have to talk about who the character is and what the trait is, and then go through and find the evidence of where they found that in the text. So citing not just the page, but the story that I looked up has line numbers or paragraph numbers, and so I would want them to specifically cite the paragraph as well. And in order to do that, I, as a teacher, would go over maybe one of the traits, maybe even 2, and then go over and have the students work in partners to find another character traits, and then I would want the students, depending on time, this would probably be at the end of one day, to go over and maybe do 2 traits on their own, on their very own. And that would be part of a beyond and a depth level knowledge of 3. Again, in order to check for understanding, I would do the thumb activity where they would hold up their thumb if they understood character traits well, sideways if they needed more clarification, and thumbs down if they needed to completely be retaught what character traits are. For the beyond part of the story, or of the lesson, this would probably take place on a separate day because this is the more difficult part. And this is where students will be going over figurative language. So as a teacher, I have read through the entire story and highlighted and looked for figurative language in the text. And I would come up with an example and then ask the students to share with their group, with their partner, what they think that the figurative language in the story meant. So for example, one of them is that the car in the story needed a lot of fixing, and then it says, quote, "The Chevy Nova had gobbled up almost $100 in repairs." What does it mean for a car to gobble up $100? The car obviously isn't eating the money, but what does that mean? And I would want the students to go over and explain to their partners what that means. And I would, in order to create a little bit of voluntary and to make sure that all of the students are on track, I would maybe use the stick method to choose a student, but because they have worked in partners, that should lower their anxiety because they should have participated and they should be able to give an example. And in that case, the students would go ahead and fill in their figurative language worksheet, which would be similar to the character trait, where they have the figurative language example and then they come up with the meaning. So after doing one lesson or one example together, I would want the students again to work on one trait or one example in pairs, and then to be able to do at least 2 examples on their own. At that point, again, I would want to check for assessment using the thumbs to see if they have been able to create or to go over a few different meanings. And for the assessment at the very end of this activity, I would do an exit ticket where the students must come up with character traits to support the secondary character, which is Miss Moreno, Yoli's mother, and they would be required to cite that evidence completely independently. And my lesson is culturally responsive because the story takes place in a predominantly Latino neighborhood in Los Angeles. Yoli and her mother are very poor, and there is no father figure in the story. A father figure is never mentioned. It talks a lot about kind of like life in a Latino barrio. Yoli attends a Catholic school where we can infer that she is Catholic. The child in the story, Yoli, goes through a lot of problems trying to fit in and trying to almost hide her poverty from her peers and her classmates. And so I would really want to get into a little bit of a discussion of why students don't always have the nicest things and how some families just can't afford luxuries because they fall secondary to necessities. And so maybe making sure that students are aware of that and sensitive to other children who might not be like them. Yoli's mother spends all of her money trying to make her daughter happy, and there is this part of the story where Miss Moreno talks about how her family immigrated to the United States from Mexico. And so I think that in a school, maybe around Oxnard, that students would really be able to know somebody in that particular circumstance, or maybe just be able to relate to that story. And that is why I chose it, and I hope that my students would like it. Thank you.